In the vast emptiness of the night, in the skin-cutting cold of a snowstorm, a wife was thrown out into the street by her own husband like a discarded object. A woman who believed she had lost everything: hope, dignity, and even herself. But in the moment of her deepest despair, she saw a faint glimmer of light, a door slightly ajar from the house next door. This is not a story of revenge, but a battle within. This is the journey of a soul reborn, learning to live once more. And the price to step through that door is to confront the bitterest truth she has never dared to face in her entire life.
Before we begin this story, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below.
My name is Elise Parker. I'm 34 years old. And what I'm about to tell you today will forever change the way you see your own family. I remember the cold before I remember the pain. The kind of cold that makes your bones ring. The kind that steals your breath first and your sanity second. Snow had crusted over the porch, and when the door locked behind me, the world went silent in a way that felt personal, as if even the night didn't want to witness what had just happened. My name is Elise Parker. I'm 34 years old. And until that night, I hadn't realized how little of myself I had left. I used to be someone. God, I used to be alive. I had ambition, sharp instincts, a talent for numbers, a job I loved. But life has a way of numbing you slowly, so slowly you don't notice until you wake up one day and the only thing left of you is whatever keeps your marriage functioning. I didn't wake up that day. Brian pushed me into it. The evening had started like every other disappointment between us, quietly. The house was too big for its own good. Every corner spotless, every cushion straight. Yet something about it felt decayed. Old emotions clung to the walls, the way mold clings to wet wood. I moved through the living room and closed the curtains because staring out the window had become a habit of mine, waiting for headlights that always arrived too late. Dinner sat on the stove, still warm. Brian had texted me hours earlier, running late. That message used to make my heart drop in fear. Now it just made me tired, exhausted really. I reheated the pasta twice, then 3 times. By 10 o'clock, I scooped everything into the trash and washed the dishes in silence. I walked past the mirror near the hallway and paused. There she was, the woman I had become. My hair clung to my face in soft waves that once made me feel pretty, but now looked limp and neglected. My mascara, smudged from rubbing my eyes earlier, gave me a hollow, bruised look. I lifted my chin slightly, taking in the pallor of my cheeks. "Who are you?" I whispered. My reflection didn't answer. I didn't expect it to. The garage door groaned open at 11:17 p.m. on the dot. Brian's timing had become predictable in all the worst ways. When he finally walked in, the scent hit me first. An expensive perfume, floral and sweet, layered over a tang of whiskey. He hadn't smelled like me in a long time. Hadn't smelled like our home either. His shirt was untucked, and a smear of lipstick stained the collar. He didn't care enough to hide it anymore. "You're late," I said softly. He brushed past me, his shoulder hitting mine. "Don't start." "Again," I whispered, not sure if I meant the lateness or the indifference. He yanked open the refrigerator and took a long swig from a bottle of water, droplets spilling onto the floor. He didn't pick them up. "I don't want to do this tonight, Elise." His voice was flat, impatient, like I was a chore he hadn't asked for. Something inside me cracked, quietly, delicately, like the first fracture on a sheet of ice. "Who is she?" I asked. He froze mid-sip. When he turned to me, his eyes were shadowed and cold. "You don't want to know." "You're right," I said. "I don't, but I need to. Because whatever's left of us, it's hanging by a thread I've been holding alone." He laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was sharp and cruel, like the scrape of metal on bone. "You think this is about us?" I swallowed. "Isn't it?" "No," he snapped. "It's about you being impossible to please. Always questioning, always suspicious, always needy." Needy. The word felt like a slap. I took a slow breath. "Brian, I've been asking for the truth since the day you started coming home, smelling like someone else's life." That was when something in his expression shifted. His jaw clenched. His eyes narrowed. His whole body coiled with a tension I recognized too well. "Get out," he said. I blinked. "What?" "Get out." His voice dropped, deeper than a growl, colder than the night behind him. This is my home too, I said, my voice trembling but steady enough. He stepped toward me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, not fear. Certainty. A cold, steady realization that this man no longer saw me as a partner, or even a person. I was an inconvenience. You're just squatting in a memory, he hissed, echoing the cruelty of someone who had rehearsed this line. He grabbed my wrist, hard. His fingers dug into my skin. I didn't fight back. I don't know if it was shock or exhaustion or the echo of all the years I had spent shrinking. He dragged me to the door. Literally dragged me. No, Brian, please. The wind tore the plea from my lips. Before I could speak again, he shoved me onto the porch. My shoulder hit the railing. The cold bit instantly through my thin nightgown. Then came the sound. Click. Final. Sharp. Deadbolt. I stood frozen, my breath white in the air, drifting upward like smoke from a dying fire. My feet sank into the snow, burning and stinging until they went numb. The night swallowed me whole. Slowly, I looked down at my hand. The porch light flickered, casting a dull glow over the gold band around my finger, my wedding ring. It looked foreign there, like it belonged to someone else's life, someone else's dream. I lifted my palm and slid the ring off. It felt strangely light, almost meaningless. I stared at it, waiting to feel heartbreak. It didn't come. What came instead was a stillness, a calm, quiet awareness that the person I used to be was still in there somewhere, buried beneath years of compromise, fear, and silence, but alive, alive enough to be angry, alive enough to feel the sting of betrayal, not as a wound, but as a spark. I curled my fingers around the ring, the metal warming slightly from my skin. I slipped it into my pocket, not to keep, but to remember who I was the night my marriage ended. The night. I was no longer the woman inside that house. A gust of wind pushed snow against my legs, and I wrapped my arms around myself. Brian's silhouette moved in the window, but he never came back to the door. He didn't look outside. He didn't check on me. He didn't care. But for the first time in a long time, I cared. Not about him, about me. And standing there in the numb, bitter cold, I made a quiet promise, not spoken aloud, but carved somewhere deep inside my chest. This was the last night I would ever let him choose who I was. He thought he had thrown me out, but he had set me free. He just didn't know it yet. The snow had soaked through the hem of my nightgown. I couldn't feel my toes anymore. My fingers were stiff, curled around themselves, useless. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't knock again. I just stood there like a ghost who hadn't realized she was dead. And then, clink. A soft metallic sound to my right. The gate creaked open, almost like the night itself had decided I'd had enough. She stood in the path of her porch light, back straight, hair silver, features unreadable. Her coat was buttoned all the way up to her chin. Her boots clicked on the stones with precision. She looked like the kind of woman no one dared lie to. "Don't be foolish," she said. "Come in before your legs betray you." I blinked, unsure if she was real or some vision my brain had conjured as it started to shut down. She turned without waiting and walked up her porch steps. I followed. Her name was Margaret Hollowell, a name I'd heard whispered with respect around the neighborhood. Most people only knew she was wealthy and private. I'd never imagined she lived so close, just beyond the brick wall, one gate away. Inside her home, the warmth hit me like an embrace I didn't realize I'd been starving for. The scent of clove, old books, and beeswax hung in the air. Her house was a mixture of elegance and history, Persian rugs layered over herringbone wood. A grand piano nestled in the corner. Firelight danced across oil paintings and antique furniture. She took my coatless frame into the living room without comment, wrapped a wool blanket around my shoulders, and placed a steaming mug into my hands. "Chamomile," she said. "Honey, no lemon. It bruises the flavor." I sat wordless on the tufted armchair near the fireplace. My hands trembled as I held the mug, trying to anchor myself to something, anything. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. After a long moment, she said quietly, "You're Elise Parker." I nodded, voice still trapped behind my shame. "You're married to Brian." The fire crackled between us. The tea tasted earthy and calming, but my throat refused to cooperate. I nodded again. I know men like him, she added. Loud when the world isn't watching, cruel in private. Still, I said nothing. She didn't fill the silence. She let it stretch until it softened. I stared into the flames, and images began to rise. Me in a crisp navy pantsuit, heels clacking against marble floors. 10 years ago, I had been a financial analyst. Efficient, respected. My days were filled with numbers, certainty, and ambition. And then I met Brian. At first, he adored that I was driven. Until he didn't. First came the jokes. You're married to your spreadsheets. Then the criticisms. No husband wants to come second to a quarterly report. And then came the guilt. Maybe if you were home more, I wouldn't have to drink alone. So I quit. 1 month after the wedding, I told myself it was love, that it was maturity, that I was choosing a life, not giving one up. Now here I was, frozen, hollow, wearing a silk nightgown in someone else's home because my husband had thrown me out like spoiled food. Margaret stirred her tea once slowly. I was a lawyer, she said. Corporate mergers, 20 years. I once negotiated a deal while in labor. That's how much I believe success required sacrifice. What happened? I croaked. My husband cheated. Left me for someone 15 years younger, said I was too intimidating. I burned out. My daughter barely spoke to me. I looked up. Did you ever forgive yourself? She nodded once. Eventually, but only after I stopped trying to rewrite the past. The way she said it, measured, almost clinical, made something inside me crack. I don't know who I am anymore, I whispered. Margaret's eyes were sharp, but not unkind. You're someone who remembers what it felt like to matter. That's more than most women in your shoes. We sat in silence again. She refilled my tea. The heat seeped back into my fingers. The ache in my chest remained. I reached for my phone, typed in my mom's number, watched it hover. I didn't press call. What are you afraid of? Margaret asked gently. That she'll tell me to go back, I whispered. That she'll ask what I did wrong. Then you're not ready to talk to her, she said. Not until you believe what happened wasn't your fault. I looked into her face, this woman I barely knew, and saw something I hadn't seen in anyone's eyes for years. Respect. Not for what I'd done, but for what I'd survived. I'm sorry for just showing up, I murmured. You didn't show up, she said. You were thrown. There's a difference. She stood and handed me a folded flannel nightgown and a towel. There's a guest room down the hall. Sheets are clean. Water takes a minute to warm up. I hesitated. Are you sure? I wouldn't have opened the gate if I wasn't. That night, I lay awake in a stranger's bed, watching shadows crawl along the ceiling. I tried to remember the last time I felt safe, not comfortable, safe. Maybe it had been childhood, or the first time I presented a report to a boardroom full of men who expected me to fail and didn't. Not in years, certainly. I spotted a photo on the dresser, a young woman in a graduation gown, grinning with crooked teeth and wild curls. Margaret beside her, proud. Tucked beside it was a handwritten note. Thank you for coming back. Tears welled again, but they were different this time. Not grief, not regret, release. I drifted to sleep sometime past 3 a.m., the warmth of someone else's home doing what my own hadn't in years, holding me together. When morning came, I woke to sunlight on my face and the sound of bacon sizzling. I padded down the hall, unsure if I was dreaming. Margaret stood at the stove, humming a hymn I didn't recognize. She turned as I entered, eyes crinkling. Good. You're up, she said. We have things to talk about. The morning light spilled into Margaret's kitchen like it belonged there. Soft and unhurried, it kissed the worn wood of her table and danced across the rim of the porcelain teacups. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her move. There was nothing urgent about her, but everything she did felt deliberate, measured, strong. You look rested, she said, without turning around. Rested enough, I replied, voice scratchy. She slid a plate across the table. Scrambled eggs, toasted rye, 2 perfect slices of bacon. Eat. Thinking on an empty stomach makes for messy decisions. I sat. The first bite nearly brought me to tears. It had been a long time since someone made food for me without expecting something in return. I thought about going back today, I said between bites. Just for a few things. My laptop, some documents. I left a part of myself in that house, and I think I need her back. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You'll go back when you're moving forward, not when you're looking for ghosts. I nodded slowly. I don't want revenge. She poured tea into my cup, dark, fragrant, slightly citrusy. Then what do you want? I want to remember who I was, and I want to understand how I forgot her. Her lips curved slightly. Good. That's the right kind of wanting. After breakfast, she led me to her study. It was like stepping into another lifetime. Heavy bookshelves lined the walls. The scent of aged paper, cedar, and old ambition filled the air. Certificates hung in polished frames. A thick rug muffled our steps. Everything in that room said power, but the quiet kind. The kind that didn't beg to be seen. She pulled out a sleek, leather-bound binder and placed it in front of me. My son Julian runs the company now, she said. Brian's been lurking. Too close. Too curious. I believe he's stealing, but he's smart. He buries his tracks deep. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the binder. I didn't know if it was fear or adrenaline. The first page hit me like a jolt of caffeine. Columns of numbers, vendor codes, wire transfers, silent signals speaking to me in a language I hadn't heard in years. There, I said, pointing. 2 entries, 3 weeks apart, same vendor ID, different amounts. And here, he used a dormant account to move $32,000. Nobody audits that one anymore. Margaret nodded. You're seeing it. I flipped pages faster now, my eyes scanning with an old rhythm I thought I'd lost. This wasn't rust. This was muscle memory buried under dust. I used to be good at this, I murmured. You still are, she said. The only thing Brian ever feared was a woman who knew how to read his lies. By the time the clock chimed noon, I had flagged 5 suspicious entries, built a theory, and started drafting a report structure in my head. It was as if the Elise who had vanished, buried under years of self-erasure, was crawling back up from the depths with a highlighter in hand and a vengeance made of spreadsheets. That afternoon, I returned to the house. Margaret insisted I take Louis, her driver, but I asked him to stay a block away. I wanted this part to be mine. No witnesses. The front door loomed like a question I already knew the answer to. I unlocked it with the spare key I'd stashed years ago, under the 3rd stone to the left. Just beneath the hydrangea bush Brian always forgot to water. The house was silent. Too silent. The kind that doesn't say peaceful, but forgotten. I moved quickly, up the stairs, straight to the study. My desk drawer was just as I'd left it, blue folder still tucked in the back. USB drives nestled beneath paper clips and old pens. I grabbed everything. In the bedroom, I avoided looking at the bed. But the closet was another story. I reached for a box on the top shelf. It was heavier than I remembered. Inside, my old company ID badge. A pair of black stilettos, a blazer, dark navy, classic cut. The kind I used to wear when I made 6-figure decisions before lunch. I slipped it on. It still fit. Maybe even better than before, because this time I didn't wear it to impress anyone. I wore it to remember that I never needed Brian's approval to be someone. Standing in front of the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because I felt different. Like I'd cracked something open and let the old Elise pour out. And damn it, she looked good. That night, I lined the bed in Margaret's guest room with papers. Every page, every transfer, every digital breadcrumb. The data whispered to me, little betrayals coded in decimals and dates. Brian had always been clever. He knew how to hide behind complexity. But what he didn't know was that I used to untangle men like him for a living. Every transaction I flagged was more than just fraud. It was vindication. Every signature was a reminder that I wasn't paranoid. I was perceptive. And I was done pretending I didn't know how to fight back. By 2 a.m., I had built a full timeline, a flowchart, a motive. I sat back in the chair, blinking against the weight of everything I had uncovered. And then I whispered, to no one and everyone, I see you now. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. I opened a notebook Margaret had left on the nightstand. The pages were thick, almost luxurious. I took a breath and wrote one sentence across the top. This isn't for revenge. It's for restoration. I stared at my wedding ring resting in the drawer. I didn't feel hate when I looked at it. I felt clarity. It was no longer a symbol of love. It was a receipt. and I had finally come to collect. The desk in Margaret's study became my battlefield. It didn't take long for the surface to disappear beneath piles of documents, printed spreadsheets, USB drives, and sticky notes color-coded like a war map. A single coffee ring stained the edge of a legal pad, like a blood mark from some financial battlefield. 10 years ago, I could spot inconsistencies in vendor logs in under 60 seconds. Back then, I was the youngest senior analyst in my firm, walking into boardrooms with 3 laptops and no fear. And yet somewhere between I do and I'm just tired, I put that woman away like a jacket out of season. Now she was back, and she had numbers to chase. I didn't ask permission. I didn't hesitate. I just worked. There was something deeply human about numbers. They didn't lie. People did. And as I combed through the files Margaret provided, expense reports, internal authorizations, layered transactions, I saw Brian's name appear like oil rising in water. The man was many things, but subtle wasn't one of them. Vendor overlap, LLC trail, 2 passive holding accounts feeding the same P.O. box address, I murmured. Circling lines in red ink. Margaret walked in, 2 mugs in hand. She watched me for a beat before placing the coffee beside me. "You've been at it for 6 hours. I didn't notice." "I know, that's how you know it's the right work." She looked at the papers, nodded slowly, and said, "I've paid forensic auditors who haven't made half this progress." I looked up. "He never thought I'd be the one following the trail." "No," she said, "because he trained you to believe you weren't capable. But you were never broken, Elise. Just underestimated. Mostly by yourself." That stung, because it was true. Later that night, I opened my old resume. It was embarrassing, thin, outdated, apologetic. Under experience, it read, "Financial analyst, 2009-2014. Left to support husband's startup." I stared at that sentence until I wanted to scream. I could still remember the day I handed in my resignation letter, shaking as I told my boss that it was time to focus on family. I told everyone it was a choice. It wasn't. It was erosion, slow, silent, and praised. Delete. I replaced it with independent financial auditor, specialty, forensic tracing, discretionary funneling, shell structure analysis. Then I added, current case, live litigation prep, 2025. I didn't smile. I exhaled. 3 days later, Julian Hollowell appeared. He was tall, refined, more polite than warm. I could see pieces of Margaret in the way he paused before speaking, as though weighing every word. "You're Elise?" he asked. I nodded. He stepped into the study, brows raising slightly at the mess. "My mother says you've done more in 4 days than our compliance team has in 3 months. "I used to do this professionally," I said, standing, straighter than I'd planned. "She says you're not charging us." "I'm not." He looked at me for a long moment. "Why are you doing this?" I hesitated, then said, "Because someone needs to hold Brian accountable, and because if I don't remember what I'm capable of now, I'll forget forever." He nodded once, not smiling, but something in his posture softened. "If this ends up in court, we'll need testimony." "I'm not afraid of speaking," I said. "Not anymore." As he turned to leave, he added, "My mother was right about you." Margaret passed by the doorway a minute later and murmured, "He never says that out loud." I found it on the 7th day. A series of consistent invoice amounts, paid every 28 days to a company called Monarch West Shipping Consultants. The company existed, barely. Registered offshore, minimal online presence, but just enough to look legitimate. I dug deeper. Monarch West didn't have a phone number, but the billing email traced back to a masked alias, an address I recognized from old Brian records. I copied it, checked it again. Then I hit the final trail. The shell account tied to the company belonged to Tasha Langston. I froze. Her name was like ice in my veins. The other woman, Brian's assistant. I hadn't seen her in nearly a year, only once from across a hospital waiting room. I remembered how she cradled her belly then. I remembered the way Brian had looked at her. I remembered the way I had looked away. I leaned back from the desk, heart pounding. So, he wasn't just cheating. He was laundering money into her name. And he was using corporate infrastructure to do it. This wasn't just personal betrayal anymore. It was criminal, Systematic, arrogant. I opened a new folder. Phase 2, Langston Link. Margaret and I sat by the fireplace that night, silence warming the air between us. "You've changed," she said, sipping her wine. "I've remembered," I replied. She nodded. "That's rarer than people think." I turned to her. "Did you ever wish you'd stayed married, just to avoid the mess?" She smiled bitterly. "I wish I'd left sooner. I wish I hadn't taught my daughter that love meant swallowing your voice." I looked into the flames. "I'm not just doing this to destroy Brian." "I know," she said. "You're doing it to rebuild Elise." Before bed, I typed a note to myself on a blank Word document. Nothing for court, nothing for proof, just for me. This investigation began as survival. It became a search for truth. Now, it is reclamation. I paused, then added one more line. "He thought he was burying me. He didn't know I was seed." And for the first time in a long, long time, I believed I could bloom again. I wasn't trying to follow her. At least that's what I told myself the first 2 times I parked across from the medical building off Lincoln Avenue. It was coincidence, I claimed. A habit, just checking something. But by the 3rd visit, I stopped lying to myself and to the quiet ache in my chest. I wanted to see her, Tasha Langston. The woman Brian had kept tucked behind assistant titles and blurred business dinners. The woman whose name showed up on the shell accounts. The woman who, according to the hospital records Margaret quietly accessed, had been admitted to maternity care 6 months ago under his insurance. She wasn't just the other woman anymore. She was the mother of his child. I sat in the car, engine off, hands locked around a paper cup of coffee I hadn't sipped in 15 minutes. Across the street, the clinic's door opened with a soft buzz. A figure stepped out. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her belly curved prominently now, stretching the hem of her knit sweater. Her boots were worn at the soles. One hand cradled her stomach with a tenderness I couldn't unsee. She paused on the steps, adjusted her coat, glanced over her shoulder as if expecting someone. No one came, and I realized, with a slow burning ache, that he wasn't with her. The first time I met Tasha was 4 years ago, in our kitchen. Brian had brought her home during a staff Christmas party. She was polite, pretty, quiet. She complimented the backsplash, asked about the wine, called him sir, like a nervous intern. He glowed in her presence. I'd hated her instantly, and hated myself for it. Because deep down, I didn't hate her. I hated the version of me that had once glowed like that, before she started calculating her worth in eye contact and unspoken disappointments. Now, watching Tasha struggle with the weight of pregnancy and the absence of support, I didn't feel rage. I felt something far worse, recognition. That night, I told Margaret. She poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a tumbler and handed it to me without speaking. We sat by the fire, and I let the silence stretch until the words found their way out. "She's alone," I said, "visibly pregnant, carrying his child, and he doesn't even show up for the appointments." Margaret's expression didn't change. He never planned to. "She's just waiting," I whispered. "For him, for his attention. For the future he probably dangled in front of her like a carrot." I took a long sip of the whiskey. It burned going down, almost enough to distract me. "I thought I'd feel triumphant," I admitted. "Like I'd caught them, like seeing her like that would make me feel stronger." "But it didn't," Margaret said. "No, it made me want to cross the street and wrap a blanket around her." She nodded. "That's because you've started healing." I didn't know what to say to that. I only knew it felt true. 2 days later, I saw her again. She was at a baby store on 6th. Alone, again. Browsing strollers with a kind of numb detachment, as if choosing between models mattered less than pretending she could afford one. She touched a soft white onesie, held it for a moment, and then quietly put it back. I don't know what possessed me, but after she left, I went inside. The store was warm and too bright. A lullaby played overhead. I found the onesie she had touched. It was soft, cream-colored. It had tiny embroidered stars around the collar and a tag that said, "Welcome to the world." I bought it. Not out of guilt, not out of spite. Out of empathy for the unborn child. For Tasha. For myself. Back home, I placed the package on my desk next to my reports. Then I sat in front of it for a long while. Eventually, I pulled out a pen and a blank note card. No return address, no signature, just a message. I don't know you, but I've been where you are. You're stronger than you think. Your child deserves love, and so do you. I slipped it into the package, taped it shut, and mailed it the next morning to the clinic's listed mailing address. I don't know if she received it, but that wasn't the point. This wasn't about outcome. This was about intention. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I thought about everything I'd lost, and everything I hadn't. I thought about the nights I cried silently so Brian could sleep peacefully, about the smiles I faked at dinners, the compromises I swallowed whole. But more than anything, I thought about the version of me I almost became, the one who could have let bitterness rot her from the inside out. And I made a quiet decision. I would not hate Tasha. I would not hate the child. I would not let Brian's betrayal breed more cruelty. The next morning, Margaret found me in the kitchen, staring into my untouched coffee. She deserves better, I said. She will never get it from him, she replied. I know. You're not responsible for her life, Elise. I know, I said again, softer. But I can still be kind, quietly, without needing credit. Margaret reached into a drawer and pulled out a small white box. Inside was a silver chain with a single pearl pendant. She may not be family, she said. But the child, he's innocent. And sometimes a simple gift says, you're not alone in this world. I nodded. My throat tightened. I didn't take the necklace. I didn't need to. Just knowing I could feel compassion again, real, unfiltered, unasked for, that was the healing. Later that day, while dusting off the top shelf of the closet in Margaret's study, I stumbled upon an old photo album. One photo in particular caught my eye. A young Margaret, standing outside a hospital, holding a tiny bundle. The joy in her face was undeniable, but her eyes carried something else, resolve. She lost him 3 months. Later, Margaret said, suddenly at the door. I hadn't heard her come in. Your son? I asked. Barely above a whisper, she nodded once. No one could understand why I never tried again. But grief, real grief, it rewires you. She walked over and placed a hand on the album. It doesn't have to end a woman, but it changes her. We stood there for a long moment in shared silence. 2 women, 2 timelines, one thread of sorrow stitched between us, and healing, slowly mending the fabric. That evening, I wrote in my notebook, forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering without bleeding. And maybe kindness is the scar. I tucked the receipt for the onesie between the pages, not as proof of generosity, as proof that I could still feel, and that somehow, after everything, my heart had survived him. Julian Hollowell's office looked like something out of a luxury catalog. Steel, glass, silence. Too immaculate, too staged. Through a thin crack in the office door, I saw him. Brian. My husband, former, I guess, was sitting across from Julian. Legs crossed, posture relaxed. Like he belonged to this place more than Julian ever had. And yet, his eyes were sharp, calculating. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I was just returning a binder. But the tension in the air pulled me in like a current. The Langston transfers, Brian said. You want me to keep them quiet. I need your full cooperation, or this, he tapped on the screen of a tablet, goes public. Julian's voice was tight. That's blackmail. No, Brian said coolly. That's insurance. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian said nothing. And in that nothingness, I heard the full scope of Brian's betrayal. This wasn't about infidelity anymore. This was about power, control, rot that spread through every vein of the life I thought I knew. I left without being seen, but I carried the weight of that moment with me like a second skin. Back in my room, I sat at the edge of the bed, phone clutched in hand, heart pounding. A message lit up, from Brian. Don't forget who helped you become who you are. Miss me, babe? Attached. A photo of him raising a glass of champagne in some high-rise bar, grinning like he'd already won. I opened my gallery. Hundreds of pictures, anniversaries, holidays, smiling selfies at arm's length. His arm around my shoulders, always just tight enough to look affectionate, but now I realized, always slightly possessive. I zoomed in on my own face in one of them. Tired, tense, fake. I selected them all. My thumb hovered over the trash icon. Then I saw one more photo, a candid one, of me in the kitchen laughing, stirring a pot of soup. Brian had caught it mid-movement, and I remembered feeling startled when he took it. Startled and tired. Even that memory felt like theft now. I hit delete all. The screen asked, permanently delete 274 items. Yes, it felt like exhaling after years of holding my breath. Later that night, I opened my old jewelry box and pulled out my wedding ring. It had always been too tight, a metaphor in hindsight. I turned it over in my palm. The inside was engraved with our initials and the words, "Until we're dust." I laughed, bitterly. Then I walked to the bathroom, lifted the toilet lid, and dropped it in. No drama, no symbolism, just release. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt empty, but in the kind of way that said, now there's space for something new. The next morning, I opened my laptop and created a folder, Truth. Inside it, everything. Screenshots of transactions, invoices, Julian's falsified accounts Brian had leveraged, files Tasha had accidentally exposed when syncing her calendar. Piece by piece, I rebuilt the puzzle of Brian's schemes, and as I clicked save for the last file, I whispered aloud, "You don't own me anymore." Margaret found me at the kitchen counter later, staring into a cold cup of tea. "You've been quiet." "Processing," I murmured. She sat beside me and waited. There was something comforting about the way she gave space, never pushing, never prying. Finally, I said, "He's not just cheating, he's blackmailing Julian." Her expression didn't change much, but her eyes darkened. I always worried Brian was a man with no roots, no remorse. Now I know for sure. I clenched the mug tighter. He could destroy your family. She looked at me then, not with anger, but resolve. Families don't break because of one man, Elise. They break when no one dares to name the truth. That evening, we sat in her study by the fire. Margaret held an old photo album on her lap. She flipped to a page. Julian as a child, sitting on her shoulders, both of them covered in sand at some beach. "I worked so hard to give him everything I never had," she said softly. "Education, wealth, a legacy. But I forgot to teach him the one thing that matters most." "What?" "To recognize danger in a charming man." I blinked. Margaret didn't usually speak in metaphors. She looked at me and smiled faintly. "You see it now, don't you? That charm isn't kindness, it's camouflage." I nodded. "I thought love could fix it," I admitted. "Fix him, fix me." Margaret shook her head. "Love doesn't fix people, it reveals them." The next morning, a flash drive appeared on my desk. No note, just one word written in bold black marker, proof. It was from Julian. I didn't need confirmation. When I opened it, I found a damning trail, communications between Brian and offshore accounts, encrypted emails, files dating back 3 years. Every lie, catalogued. It should have made me feel powerful. Instead, I felt grief again, not for Brian, but for the version of me that still believed he was redeemable. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I stood in front of the mirror in my room, fully clothed, hair a mess, eyes red from tiredness, but I didn't look away. I looked into my own eyes and said, "You are no longer her, you are no longer his." I let the tears fall, not out of weakness, out of truth. I wasn't crying for the marriage anymore. I was crying for how long I had betrayed myself. I wrote in my journal, healing isn't loud, it's the quiet choices, to delete, to walk, to speak the truth, to stand still and say, enough. And that night, I slept deeply, for the first time in years, without dreaming of escape, just stillness and silence, but not the suffocating kind, the sacred kind. The flash drive Julian gave me felt like a weapon disguised as hope. Inside were files, carefully compiled records of Brian's financial manipulations, shell transfers, blackmail schemes. Every byte was a strand in the web he thought invisible. Julian didn't look me in the eyes when he handed it over. "Use it wisely," he muttered, jaw clenched. Guilt sat in his shoulders like sandbags. His silence had bought Brian more time than it ever should have. That night, I sat beside Margaret in her den, firelight flickering off the glass of her tea. I told her everything. My voice barely rose above the crackling logs, but she didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she looked at me and said, "Once you decide to fight back, Elise, you don't get to be the same woman again. Are you ready for that?" "I don't know who I am now," I replied, honestly. "But I know who I'm not." She smiled, sadly, knowingly. The next morning, I got to Hollowell Holdings before the sun. The sky was still a deep, bruised gray. I carried the flash drive like it was fragile glass. Every step toward the server room felt like a march into war. Julian was already waiting. Carla, a young IT lead with keen eyes, took the drive from me. "No network, no wireless. I've isolated a secure vault," she explained, slipping it in. We watched the screen in silence. 3%, 17%, 28%. Then, flicker, static, freeze. A window popped up in blinking red. Data corruption detected. File system compromised. Carla gasped. "No, this wasn't supposed to happen." She tried again. New terminal, different protocol, still gone. The files were vapor. Julian turned slowly to me. "You told me it was clean." "It was," I said, breath shallow. He must have." My phone buzzed. "Unknown number," I answered. "Nice try, babe." Brian's voice poured like ice into my ear. "Julian's a coward, and I've always been 2 steps ahead. You should have stayed quiet." "You destroyed it," I breathed. He laughed, soft and slow. "You were always good at pretending. Go back to that. No one listens to women like you anyway." Click. I didn't drop the phone, but my hand might as well have shattered. I walked out of the building like I was moving through water. Cold, silent. Heaviness clung to every limb. I wandered through a back hallway, found myself on a rusted metal stairwell behind the building, slumping down with my coat clutched to my chest. I felt like a balloon whose string had snapped. Adrift, useless. And then came the memories, not just of him, of me, the girl who once stayed up late waiting for him with dinner cold on the table. The woman who held her breath when he unlocked his phone in the dark. The wife who once believed forgiveness was strength and silence was love. Even in the beginning, I had known, deep down, I had swallowed every truth because survival was easier than honesty. Margaret found me 2 hours. Later, eyes red from the wind. Voice calm. "Come inside," she said. "I failed," I whispered. She shook her head. "He only destroyed a drive, not your mind. I needed that proof. You needed to see what he is, and you did. That's your proof. Now what are you going to do with it?" Her words didn't lift the weight, but they gave me somewhere to place it. That night, I didn't sleep. I wrote. I poured everything I remembered into notebooks, loose paper, even the back of envelopes. Receipts, conversations, dates, names, lies. The paper soaked in my pain, my rage, my voice. At 2 a.m., my fingers cramped. I changed pens 3 times. I taped torn pages together. I even started diagramming relationships and accounts from memory. I couldn't stop. I wouldn't. Because even if Brian erased the evidence, I could rebuild the truth. Not for the courtroom, but for me. At 3:47 a.m., I stepped outside. The garden was shrouded in fog, silver light bleeding into the grass. I stood barefoot on the frostbitten earth, inhaling the sharp night air like medicine. I remembered something he once told me. "You look better when you're quiet." And I remembered how, over time, I had learned to whisper instead of speak, to nod instead of question, to smile instead of scream. I wasn't that woman anymore. Back inside, I lit a single candle, the only light in the room. I placed it next to my notebooks. I added a photo, a simple one. Me, hair tied back, no makeup, eyes tired but honest. The kind of picture you keep hidden. The kind that tells the truth. I sat beside it and wrote slowly, deliberately. He took the files, but not the memories. Not my words, not my witness. Smoke blinds, mirrors distort. But I see now, and I refuse to unsee. Dawn peeled over the horizon in strips of soft pink and gray. I watched from the kitchen window, arms folded, breath fogging the glass. And then I stepped out the front door, hair unbrushed, notebook in hand, and let the morning swallow me whole. Not because I had won, but because I was still here. And the story wasn't over. Not yet. The morning after the drive was wiped, I woke before the sun, staring at the ceiling with my hands clenched under the blanket. Not from cold, from disbelief, from rage. Brian's voice still rang in my ears. That smug laugh, that sickening "nice try, babe." It was like being slapped in the dark by someone who'd been hiding in the room the whole time. I didn't cry, not then, I couldn't. Something inside me had shifted, crystallized. The girl who needed closure, who needed proof, who needed justice, she was gone. All that remained was a woman with nothing left to lose. I walked barefoot to the kitchen. Margaret was there, already dressed, reading a newspaper she didn't seem to actually read. She didn't say good morning. She didn't ask if I was okay. She simply turned to the counter and slid something toward me, a small black flash drive. I stared at it. My pulse froze. What? Margaret's eyes didn't leave mine. You think I didn't make a backup? My jaw slackened. You knew he'd destroy it. I knew he'd try, she said. I also knew you needed to feel what it was like to lose everything. Because only then do we stop fearing the fall. I blinked, unable to hold the heat building in my eyes. You didn't fail, Elise, she said. You were tested, and you're still here. We spent the next 3 days buried in her study. Carla came back, helping us transfer the files into a secure, air-gapped system. Julian showed up on the second day, quieter than usual, but more focused. He double-checked every ledger, annotated every transfer, and offered no excuses for his part in Brian's scheme. I didn't need apologies, I needed allies. The files had everything: falsified contracts, hidden offshore transfers, evidence of insider trading, even clips of conversations Brian thought no one had recorded. He wasn't just a bad husband. He was a criminal with a god complex. I documented everything, labeled it, organized it. At night, I wrote in my journal, not just about the case, but about myself. The things I'd given up, the woman I'd allowed him to rewrite, and the one I was writing back into existence. On the third evening, Margaret found me in the conservatory, sitting with a glass of red wine I hadn't touched. You're holding your breath, she said, sitting beside me. I don't know what comes after this, I whispered. She smiled faintly. The truth. I'm not scared of him anymore, I said, but I am scared of the silence after, when it's just me. Margaret leaned forward, eyes warm. You were never just you, Elise. You are everything he tried to extinguish, resilient, kind, fierce. That's why he feared you. I looked away, blinking fast. I never wanted revenge, I said. I just wanted my life back. She nodded. Then take it. The gala was set for Friday night, a sea of crystal chandeliers, gold-rimmed, glasses, Hollowell Holdings' finest faces gathered in one grand hall of polished marble and fragile egos. I didn't wear a dress. I wore a suit. Dark charcoal, tailored to me. No jewelry, no frills. Nothing for him to soften. When I arrived with Margaret, the room buzzed like static. I saw the curious glances. I saw Brian before he saw me, standing beneath a spotlight, laughing with some senator's wife, mask perfectly in place. He was untouchable, or so he thought. Julian stepped onto the stage at 8:01 p.m. sharp. He opened with formalities, then introduced the keynote speaker. Me. As I approached the stage, I saw Brian's face shift. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition turning into something darker, panic. The lights dimmed except for the one on me. I stood behind the podium. My palms didn't sweat. My voice didn't shake. Good evening, I said. My name is Elise Parker, and tonight I'm not here as a wife or a former employee. I'm here as a woman who finally stopped apologizing. I paused. I spent 10 years beside a man who smiled for cameras and stole behind curtains, who told me I was crazy when I asked questions, who told me to be quiet because silence looked better on me. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Tonight, that ends. Behind me, the screen lit up. Carla cued the first slide. Bank transfers, forged contracts, emails signed with Brian's name. People turned toward him. His mask didn't crack. It shattered. And still, I continued. This isn't about revenge, I said. It's about accountability, about reclaiming what fear made me forget, my voice, my truth, and my future. I looked directly at him. For every woman who's ever been silenced, disbelieved or erased. I see you, and I'm not quiet anymore. Security escorted Brian out less than 15 minutes later. Some guests gasped, others stared. Margaret stood in the shadows, arms folded, eyes glassy. I didn't cry, not then. But when the applause came, not loud but steady, real, I felt something inside me exhale for the first time in years. Afterward, back at Margaret's, I changed into pajamas and curled onto the sofa with tea. She walked in, handed me a blanket, and said, "You were magnificent." I laughed softly. I was terrified. That's what made it brave. We sat in silence, watching the fire crackle. And then she said something I'll never forget. "You're not just free from him now. You're free to be whoever you want next." The ballroom shimmered in gold and polished glass, a world far removed from truth. Hollowell Holdings' annual gala was always more than a celebration. It was a stage. And tonight I would claim it, not as Brian Parker's wife, not as the silent half of someone else's empire, but as a woman finally done whispering. As I waited behind the velvet curtain, Margaret stood beside me. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her presence had become my compass. Carla adjusted the mic discreetly on my jacket, gave me a small nod. Julian was already seated near the front, avoiding eye contact. But here, that mattered. When the host called my name, the audience shifted. There was no expectation attached to me. Most of them didn't even know why I was on the program, but by the end of the night, they would. I walked to the stage. My heels struck the floor with deliberate sound, each step a crack in the old mask. The spotlight hit me, hot and unrelenting, but I didn't blink. I met it like I would meet the truth, head on. "Good evening," I began, voice steady. "I'm Elise Parker. Some of you know me as Brian Parker's wife, but tonight I stand before you as someone else, someone he worked very hard to erase." There were small ripples of movement in the crowd, curious glances, tilted heads. Somewhere in the back, I caught sight of him, Brian, standing still, arms crossed, his face unreadable, but I could feel the tension. I clicked the remote. Behind me, the screen lit up. For the last several months, I've been quietly investigating a number of irregularities within Parker Financial and its ties to Hollowell Holdings. What I found was systematic fraud, embezzlement, and the deliberate manipulation of public trust. The room shifted from mild discomfort to alert. The first slide appeared, a detailed spreadsheet, cross-referenced with internal email chains. "Brian Parker," I said, "built his success on a foundation of lies, forged documents, offshore laundering, intimidation, and he didn't work alone." Brian stepped forward. "Elise, what are you doing?" His voice was low, forced calm. "I'm telling the truth," I replied without flinching. "Something you've avoided your entire life." Security moved subtly. Carla was monitoring everything from backstage. Julian, to his credit, didn't move. He looked down, eyes heavy with guilt. "Let me show you how deep it goes," I continued. More evidence appeared. Bank transfers labeled under philanthropic fronts, personal expenditures masked as consulting fees, audio recordings of Brian coercing junior partners. The silence in the room thickened. Some people gasped, others looked down, suddenly remembering every deal they made with him. "This isn't about revenge," I said. "It's about accountability. For years, Brian used charm to manipulate, wealth to silence, and fear to maintain control. But tonight, that control ends." I turned toward him, my eyes locking on his. "You always said no one would believe me," I said, "that I'd sound hysterical, emotional, unstable. But here we are, and I'm none of those things. I'm clear, I'm calm, and I'm done." Security approached Brian as murmurs grew into whispers. "I've done nothing illegal," he snapped. "She's just bitter." "Funny," I said, "because I have all the documents, Brian, including your threats to Julian, the coercion, the falsified accounts under Tasha's name." His jaw clenched. "Oh, and yes," I added, "I met Tasha. She didn't know what she was part of. She just wanted to be loved. You used her too." That hit. His face flickered. Not with shame, he wasn't capable of that, but with fear, real, unmistakable fear. They tried to escort him out quietly, but someone had already pulled out their phone. The first video hit social media within minutes. The narrative was no longer his to control. After he was gone, I stood there a moment longer, not to bask, but to breathe. For anyone here who's ever been gaslit, I said softly into the mic. For anyone who's ever questioned their own reality because someone they loved told them to, this is for you. I looked out at the room, not as an enemy, not even as a victim, but as something Brian had never expected. Whole. The applause was hesitant at first, then stronger. I stepped off the stage, heart pounding not with fear but with release. Margaret met me backstage. Her eyes were misty, but her voice was steady. You didn't just take him down. You reclaimed yourself. Outside, the air was crisp. I stood for a moment, letting it hit my skin, letting it remind me I was alive, really alive. Back home, I changed into an old sweatshirt, washed my face, and sat by the fireplace. Margaret poured us tea. She didn't ask how I felt. She just handed me the cup and said, "Now you begin again." I nodded, staring into the flames. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. And for the first time in years, I didn't fall asleep listening for footsteps. I just slept and dreamt of silence that didn't ache. After everything, I expected the end to feel louder, more dramatic, more final. But in reality, it felt like a soft exhale, like the closing of a book that had already been read too many times. In the weeks following the gala, the storm around Brian exploded. Press releases, legal action. Board members scrambling to distance themselves. His name, once printed on glossy covers and finance magazines, was now stamped across headlines with words like fraud, collapse, betrayal. I didn't follow the news, not out of apathy, but because my chapter with him was already closed. He had been indicted. Julian gave a public apology, stepping down from the board but not vanishing. And as for Tasha, she vanished quietly. Word spread that she left the country to start over. I didn't seek her out. I hoped she found peace. Me, I found something different. Not peace, not yet, but presence. For the first time in a decade, I woke up not anticipating the weight of a man's mood. I made coffee the way I liked it, strong, unsweetened. I took morning walks in Margaret's garden, each step reminding me that I had a body, not just one that endured, but one that moved forward. Margaret never pushed. She didn't try to mother me or fix me. She simply sat with me, through silence, through tea, through long afternoons reading books and folding laundry. Her love wasn't loud. It was shelter. One evening, after a long walk, she turned to me and said, "You know you've already walked out, right? You don't need to wait for permission to begin." And that stayed with me. A few days later, I returned to the house. Not for closure, just for clarity. The place was cold, hollow, like a museum of memories I no longer lived in. In the living room, dust had settled on the piano I once played. Upstairs, our bed remained untouched. The sheets still pulled tight, as if pretending things were still in order. I moved through each room, touching nothing, taking only mental photographs of what I had once accepted as normal. Then, I stepped into the office, Brian's sanctuary. I half expected it to reek of power, but all I found was dust and emptiness. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk and found something I hadn't expected. A photo of us, early days, smiling, young, before the unraveling. For a second, I remembered how badly I had wanted that version of us to last. How long I had blamed myself for its decay. Then I closed the drawer. Downstairs, I placed a single item on the fridge. A photo of me and Margaret. Arms linked, laughing in the garden. It didn't match the aesthetic of the house, but it belonged to my new story. Beside it, I placed the tiny baby shoe I had once bought after seeing Tasha at the clinic. I wasn't sure why I kept it all this time, but maybe because it reminded me that even in the deepest pain, I had chosen compassion. Before I left, I stood in the doorway one last time and whispered, "Thank you for the lessons." Then I locked the door, not in fear, in finality. Back at Margaret's, I began rebuilding, not just life, but meaning. The consulting firm she gifted me became the seed of something bigger, not a financial empire, but a foundation for women like me. Women silenced, manipulated, erased. We provided legal aid, business strategy, emotional support, and most of all, validation. I hired women who had been laid off for being too difficult, too loud, too direct. I gave internships to girls from shelters. I spoke on panels, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testimony that survival is a beginning, not a destination. Carla became my head of operations. Julian, surprisingly, donated anonymously every month. He never asked for recognition. I never needed him to. 1 year after the gala, I stood in front of a camera again. This time for our foundation's first anniversary. The team asked me to record a message. I stared into the lens, and without a script, I spoke from the place that used to tremble. My name is Elise Parker. A year ago, I walked away from everything I thought defined me. And for a while, I was lost. I had no title, no home, no plan. But I did have a choice, and I chose not to disappear. I took a breath. I didn't get justice in the form of revenge. I got something better, truth. And from truth came healing. From healing came clarity. And from clarity came purpose. My voice softened. I know some of you watching are still in the middle of the storm, still quiet, still afraid. But hear this. You are not alone. You are not crazy. And you are not too late to start over. A pause. Then with a smile. You are not broken. You are just not finished yet. That night, Margaret and I sat on the porch under the stars. She held my hand, not tightly, just enough to say, I'm here. Do you regret anything? She asked. I thought about that. The years I lost. The pieces of myself I handed away. The pain, the anger, the doubt. Then I shook my head. No, because without all of it, I wouldn't have walked out. Margaret nodded, sipping her tea. Then walk forward, Elise. The world's been waiting. And I did. Not as someone who survived, but as someone who had finally arrived. Not everyone who walks away is giving up. Some people step out of hell, not to seek revenge, but to find themselves again. Elise Parker did not win by getting her husband, money, or reputation back. She won when she no longer needed any of it. In a world where women are seen as weak for forgiving or selfish for daring to let go, Elise chose the hardest thing of all, to live kindly with herself. If you have ever stood at the threshold of a difficult choice, if you have ever stayed silent in the dark just to hold together a breaking family, share your story below. Not to complain, but to remind one another, you are not alone, and you deserve a new chapter.